Hi there. So I'm back here trying to get you a recording today. This is going to be a recording that's going to be looking at our very first chapter we're going to be looking at in your textbook, Indigenous Peoples Within Canada. We're not going to be looking at chapter 1. If you want to look at that chapter, you can at your own time. You will not be required to make notes on it. There will be no exam questions on chapter 1 of this textbook. We are starting today, though, on chapter 2. And chapter 2 is titled At the Beginning. Now, this chapter is a very brief chapter, so hopefully this lecture won't be very long. It is going to cover kind of the first initial background, if you will, that Newbigging and Dickinson kind of cover. Before I get into actually going through the chapters we're going to cover in this book, this textbook, I really must clarify that there are some concerns that I've expressed in previous semesters, and I believe I've also expressed it in a few lectures that I've shared with you. The textbook does have some issues. It does refer to treaties, the number of treaties as being cede, release, and surrender, and I hope you're now comfortable with that after spending this much time in the course, that you recognize that it cannot possibly be true. It is a misconception that continues to exist, and unfortunately academics that don't have the oral history and the actual background with connection to elders in the community and access to knowledge holders, knowledge keepers, continue to perpetuate these misconceptions. And unfortunately, this textbook is one of them. In addition, I've tried to also introduce the idea of deconstructing our language as we start this process of recognizing what colonization is. And as we're moving toward trying to see then at the end of the course, well, if this is colonization, this is what colonization has done, and this is what it is today, then what does that mean now for us as we start the process of perhaps considering a process of decolonization? And as part of that, we need to acknowledge the place and the purpose and the role that the English language plays in that. It is a mismatch of many languages. It is a mismatch of Latin words, French words, Spanish words to some extent, German words. So it is a very colonial language. So a lot of the words that are used in this book that are the chapters we're going to be covering, I'll be drawing your attention to them. So I just wanted to let you know up front as an introduction to the textbook, though I do think it is indeed a concise history of what happened here in Canada to the Indigenous peoples that are the original peoples that were here and are here still, that there are some issues with it. And so with that, I'm going to start the chapter. Now, as you can see, I have the PowerPoint slideshow up on the screen. It is covering the 4th edition of this textbook. Here is the first page of the chapter. All right, you'll notice it has some learning outcomes. And it goes into a timeline, which I always think is interesting just to kind of go through. On page 20, it covers a period of time from 75,000 to 25,000 before the current era. So in case you're still kind of thinking the other terms, before Christ, BC, and up to 1200 ACE, current era. Okay, so this is after the current era. This is kind of like where we're kind of now. So that's current era, AD. Okay, if that makes any sense at all. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting because it kind of covers what is covered in the chapter. So let's get into it. So now this is going to be a required resource when we get to the module on treaty education, treaty history. So that's just being put up there for you now if you want to watch it. It is about an hour and 20-minute video. It was taped probably now about 2.5 years ago. It's still a very important piece, I think, that we can reference. An elder speaks there to treaty knowledge around the time when the number of treaties were actually being negotiated. So we will be referencing that later in the course. That's for your reference right now. It isn't required for the midterm, but we will be referencing it further in the course. All right. So then it starts to get into, on page 21, it jumps into this migrations, movements, and settlement. And what it really does is it introduces this idea of Beringa, this piece of land that became evident after the waters receded a bit, and so it became a land bridge. And of course, that is one of the major theories, how North America, South America, Central America were all populated. This again goes against what our elders tell us, that we've always been here, that we were placed here by the Creator. So keep that in mind as you're reading some of this. There is a lot of controversy around that to this day. Yeah, we probably looked at that and covered that in your Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan book as well, so I won't get into that too much. Having said that, the chapter does begin by looking at this land bridge that existed between Asia and North America that kind of became evident in two periods, 75,000 before present, as well as 14,000 before present. So the chapter talks about how the Algonquins, they fan northward from the Great Lakes during this period where it was periods of warming and cooling. And so you start to see the actual migrations of individuals outlined very briefly in the beginning of the chapter to kind of give us a bit of a context to where they eventually landed as we start to get into more of the current telling of the story about the peoples here on what's today called North America. The Northwestern Plains buffalo hunters, they came from the south and east. The Athabascans, of course, they moved south from the far north. The forebears of the Inuit spread eastward across the Arctic from Siberia. And at the bottom of the page, there's a section called Early Technology. Now, this is a section that really starts to look at this idea of stone and bone technology. And when we first think about it, we think that it's very archaic, that it is substandard to what we consider more advanced, more developed, more sophisticated. That would be the metal tools. That would be the first impression. And I think you're starting to get used to, in this course, getting a completely different take on it. And this is another one. To be very clear, the type of technology, the stone and bone technology that existed here in this hemisphere was very advanced. And in many respects was more advanced in its ability to effectively do things than what was over there without disturbing the landscape. Rather than digging up iron and all these other minerals, what you have is a whole hemisphere that focused on using just what was available. And that's why it was stone and bone. It wasn't that they didn't have probably the opportunity to get into mining to the extent that was happening over there. There was a very conscious choice as a collective hemisphere that didn't occur on a large scale, except in some pockets, primarily in the south, but not to the extent that was happening over there. All right, there was a hemisphere-wide understanding about relationship to the land, as we've talked about. And from that, you have the evolution of a very sophisticated stone and bone tool technology that reached its highest point of development among the indigenous peoples here in this hemisphere. Inca created the largest stone empire in the world. Over 200 ethnic groups existed within it. The Machu Picchu, I don't know if you ever heard of it, 250 meters above the sea. And if you look at pictures of it, and I think I may have provided you some links to it, it's incredible. Google it. It's the stones that they got to that height and the sophisticated architecture that was created with stone. It's a wonder of the world. It truly is. And then, of course, it talks about the plains culture developed from the contact of Eastern peoples who migrated to the plains. And then we'll talk about that further into the textbook as we get into chapter 3, 4, thereabouts. So these emerging cultures that the chapter starts to look at then, it starts to really focus on what really was here. And on the bottom of page 22, under cultural adaptations and resource management, and resource management, by the way, is another term of deconstructing, okay? That is another term that just to flag it. At the time of first European contact with North America, that of the Norse, about 1000 ACE, most of the nations of the area would become Canada were hunters and gatherers. We know more about hunting activities than we do about gathering activities because hunting left recognizable debris that archaeologists could study, while gathering left very little. And it talks about this idea that various traditions have also carefully preserved the complex exploitation of plants for medicinal purposes. The hunter and gatherer way of life evolved over thousands of years and grew out of an intimate knowledge of resources and the best way of exploiting them. Exploiting is another word we have to deconstruct. From this knowledge of how and where plants would grow, North American people developed a new technology for managing food resources, farming. And then it starts to talk about the cultivation of plants that start to take off here. And the background of it is really, and we've talked about this already, plant domestication could not have occurred without extensive botanical knowledge of the plants, and it was already in place. The growing of crops and the raising of animals for food in Americas, and that's incorrect too, because there was very few draft animals here. There was a few areas that did have keep their animal food sources close by, but there were very small areas that did it. In South America, there were a couple areas that kept the wild chickens around them. They just would come right in around where they eat. So there was a couple of places like that, but the idea of raising food, such as it was happening in Europe, that didn't happen here to the extent it happened there. Like that, it was just, you can't even compare them. So another term that we should really just kind of flag is the idea of raising of animals for food. But it does talk about this jump in CO2 about 15,000 years ago, and how this kind of maybe had some implications for what kind of started to develop from there. Increase in CO2 made photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight to energy, more efficient, increasing growth and size. That might have triggered their domestication and emergence of farming in that period. Squash seeds found in the Mexican cave have been dated to about 10,000 years ago, and archaeological evidence shows that gourds were domesticated before corn, and so were squash and avocados. The first dates to about 9,000 BCE. While the last two date to about 8700 BCE. Various beans, chili peppers, amaranth are at least as old. However, the Haudenosaunee origin story includes the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that we talked about before, together since time immemorial. So whether indigenous peoples tried to domesticate these crops separately before realizing the advantage of cultivating them together, or whether the archaeological evidence is incomplete, it's difficult to say. Probably plant domestication began in several different places with various plants. And then on page 26, it starts to get into this idea of animal harvesting that we're going to briefly cover. But again, that harvesting is another word I'll flag for deconstruction. It's just kind of a term that doesn't quite fit, but we will just accept that here. Indigenous agriculture concentrated on plants rather than animals, but in terms of resource management, in a broader sense, indigenous peoples exerted a lot of control over animals. Fishing played a part in these early resource management efforts. Classic Maya agriculturalists, for instance, were also fish farmers. North American farmers and hunters used fire to control directly the movements of animals, such as those of the buffalo on the prairies, and to modify vegetation, which in turn influenced the animals' feeding patterns. For instance, in the 16th century, the farming people of northeastern woodlands of North America had transformed their habitat into one particularly suitable for deer, the so-called deer parks. There's ample evidence that stocks of game animals and fish were closely monitored and harvested accordingly. So the elaborate ceremonies were undertaken to continue to preserve adherence to conservation practices at all times. And as we looked at in Ways of Knowing and Being, chapter 1 of Yale Boulanger's chapter, they were also considered these ceremonies as part of the need to continue the cycles of life. And on the bottom, or halfway through page 27, it talks about this idea of another practice that was used was these buffalo jumps. So what they would do is that it would require the whole tribe, because the herds were huge. My dad said that you would hear them coming for days. And it's the thunder, it would get like a thunder. And then once they arrived, the herds, they would run past for days. There were literally millions of buffalo at contact. That's why the people were so healthy, and that's why it was so easy to follow them. The way that they would do it with these buffalo jumps is they would have warriors, hunters, and they would kind of just bring off the edge of a herd, and just so that they would just get enough, and they would kind of, all the people would stand along the edges, and they would, they have their ways of whatever to kind of scare them to just keep going in a thin row straight toward the cliff. And then at the bottom of the cliff, there would be the hunters there to actually kill them after they fell off the cliff. And they wouldn't kill a lot. They would just kill what they needed. That's the way that they did it. Because if you've ever seen a buffalo, they're huge. They're absolutely huge. So you wouldn't need very many of them to feed a tribe. And that again, would have been very carefully monitored and not exploited. And then it gets into this idea, and we've really talked about this, that right across what we call Canada today, and North America in general, there are all these different regions. And there's pictures on page 28 and 29 that kind of capture that in your textbook. All these different colors were different ecosystems, ecological regions that had very distinct ways. And in the areas around the boundaries, the colors, there would be these transition zones that would be half one and half the other. So the individual tribes or peoples that lived within these regions adapted to those different ecosystems, and the fauna that was there, the flora and the fauna, right, that existed. And that's kind of how it developed their cultures and their societies and made them sustainable. So we have the tundra in the far north, very harsh, very isolating. Polar bears, whales, walruses, seals, and those were the Inuit hunters, right, the gatherers. Then you have the Hudson Bay lowland region, again quite isolating yet. Caribou, muskox, and in those regions would have been the Neowal, the Cree, the Inuit, and the Innu. And the boreal forest, or the taiga region, you have the moose, beaver, black bear, Ojibwe or Anishinaabe traders pre-contact. That would have been the peoples that were there. Very developed trade networks within that region. It was kind of like the transition zone from the north to what was into the south, if you will. So they became very, very adapting to what each tribe could contribute to the network itself. So they had very vibrant trade networks, and they were well established by the time contact occurred. And you were having trade occurring from vast different distances from the far north to the far south through all these different networks that existed here. Then you have the Carolinian forest that's discussed on page, that goes into it on page 30. Starts to take a look at this and goes in from there to the grasslands. Did you know that the grasslands is the most transformed region on Earth? Because of what happened after colonization, you have this entire region being turned into the so-called breadbasket of the world. And we're going to look at that in the module where we're going to talk about the nation-building strategy of John A. Macdonald, the first so-called fathers of Confederation. The plan was that they were going to make the Great Plains all wheat, all grains. It was going to grow. It's going to be the place where they're going to make all the food for the world, at least one of the major ones. And that's exactly what they did. It's You're hard pressed to find true grasslands, native grasslands on the Great Plains right now. In pockets, small pockets perhaps, a form of it, but the extent to how much it has been transformed since contact makes it the most transformed region on the planet due to man's footprint on it. And so within the Carolinian forest and the grasslands you have here on the slide, what would have been the primary fauna, as well as the individual peoples that would have been in those areas as well, all right? And then, of course, the Pacific Maritimes. This is what would be the area of the coastline along BC, okay? Grizzly bear, elk, bighorn sheep, salmon, and Haida people would be one example of the people that would be there. And this exact section here on page 32, we've really covered this, so I don't think I need to cover it too much. I'll leave it for you because it is going to be required fair game parts of the chapter. We have gone through it a considerable amount. What is talked about in this section here. Newcomers were noted the peaceful relations. We've talked about that. I've alluded to that already. The only places really that they had chieftains that were kind of hierarchical were on the northwest coast, where they had classes and very clear distinctions between the actual classes themselves. Page 33 at the bottom, it talks about the general lack of quarreling or interpersonal conflict in Indigenous communities impressed Europeans, who wondered how peaceful relations could prevail without the threat of force in the background. One European visitor reported in the 18th century that some chiefs who were skillful leaders, as they knew how to confine their commands within the limits of their power. First Peoples, for their part, were not impressed when they saw Europeans being afraid of their captains, while they laugh and make sport of theirs. That should resonate with you because what we've covered so far in the course. Now these two chapters, they're not going to be required. They are referencing those Sylvia McAdams teachings where she talks about the Creator's laws. We've kind of alluded to them in the course, in the first module particularly. I leave this for you to, if you want to explore it in more depth. They're really great lectures to help you with that. So I'm going to leave that with you. Creator's laws and legal traditions guided and directed the people in their daily interactions with each other, within families, communities, and relations among peoples. Creator's law affect and are parts of all aspects of life. Given to the people by the Creator to follow and abide by, the laws are the protocols and etiquette in place to guide and direct people to appropriate access to traditional ethics. Protocols are the foundation of the way the people are to communicate and live by with each other and among the rest of creation. And all of the Creator's creations have laws that they must abide to, not just humans. So I'll leave those to you if you want to explore that more, all right? And then on chapter 30, page 35, gets into trade and alliances. Now this is an important section. As social development throughout the Americas varied, relationships between Indigenous peoples also varied. Variations between hunting and gathering societies and those who picked up aspects of agricultural cultures created differences in resource strengths and needs, which encouraged cooperation in trade. The ecological basis for trade meant that the way of life for each was richer for their inter-exchange through trade. The Indigenous peoples of the Americas lived within cultural frameworks that met social and individual needs by emphasizing the group as well as the self. This was true even among those peoples, particularly in the far north, whose groupings changed with the season and availability of food. Land, like air and water, was for the benefit of everyone, and so was communally owned. Because of the extensive coastline, the longest of any nation in the world, many of the first peoples within what would become Canada had maritime orientation. However, the variety in the area's geographical regions, whether it was the Arctic, subarctic, northwestern woodlands, Great Plains, the plateau, or the northwest coast, resulted in many variations on fundamentally similar ways of life. For example, many of the Indigenous groups in central Canada had a lacustrine or riverine orientation, perhaps not a maritime one. So that, this is, I think it's important for us to continue to draw attention to, especially when we start to talk about trade and diplomacy. That starts on the bottom of page 35. Uneven distribution of resources and an ecological basis of trade ensured that all of these people traded. In general, some people had access to greater agricultural opportunities, while others had better hunting and fishing opportunities. So good relations, alliances, and the transfer of spiritual powers were of utmost importance in these exchanges, rather than economic considerations. However, there could be trade with an enemy if the parties could agree on a truce. In this case, they bring up the Haudenosaunee here. And the peoples of the Great Lakes were always resolved by reestablishing trade when they had conflicts. They sealed agreements by an exchange of gifts and hostages, which led to the formation of blood ties, because a hostage would eventually marry into or become part of the tribe through that process. They sealed agreements by this exchange. Alliances were less important in the far north, where hostilities were expressed in chance killings or raids rather than in warfare. So Indigenous people measured wealth either in material goods or in immaterial rights, such as those to certain songs, dances, or rituals. The principle of sharing prevailed as far as the basic necessities of life were concerned, and a moral imperative to share was a distinctive feature of all Indigenous communities. The kinship groups divided up the village's hunting, fishing, and gathering territories. Acquiring prestige called for generosity. Individuals traded for goods to give away on ceremonial occasions such as a potlatch, or here on the Great Plains or Sundance ceremonies. Gift exchanges were, I give to you so that you may give to me. They were a very social and diplomatic obligation. Indigenous peoples presented gifts when people visited each other on special occasions, such as marriage and name-giving, or for obtaining the return of prisoners of war. Status was important in these exchanges. The higher the rank of the recipients, the greater the value of the gifts. Gifts also sealed agreements and alliances with other people. Indigenous peoples did not see treaties as self-sustaining. To be kept alive, treaties needed to be fed every once in a while by ceremonial exchanges. Later, during the colonial wars, periodic gift distributions would be essential in maintaining the alliances that proved so useful to the colonizing powers. Gift distribution helped to keep the alliances intact when periodic setbacks threatened to dismantle military cooperation that was of vital importance to both sides. Trade goods could travel long distances. For instance, obsidian, valued for tools because of its keen cutting edge and also for ceremonial purposes because of its beauty, has been found on archaeological sites far from its place of origin. The copper trade was also active. Various kinds of shells, depending on the region, were also much in demand for personal adornment and because of their commercial, diplomatic, and ceremonial value and use. So, see, this is the thing that I want to read that very clearly to you, because that's an important section that, we really need to understand the significance of gifting, as especially we start to look into post-contact and the gift distributions that are going to become a reoccurring theme throughout the chapter. So I want you to park that and remember that, all right? And then the chapter on page 36 starts to talk about this idea of alliances. There was an incredible array of alliances, and I think hopefully you've kind of caught that in our module looking at leadership, traditional American Indian leadership, that there were very complex systems that existed here. And we've looked at the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Well, there was also the Wendat one as well that had extensive connections. The territory of the Haudenosaunee was larger than the lands of the Wendat Confederacy, although their population was smaller. The League's territory stretched from the Mohawk River in the east to the Genesee River in the west, a distance of about 180 kilometers. So that would put us about from here to Broadview, Saskatchewan, Regina, if you know that distance, okay? It was a geographic position that would become strategically important to the European colonies on the east coast, as it controlled the major routes from the coast to the interior. Each member nation occupied its own villages, usually 2 or more. Each also had its own council, as did each group, whose council usually met in the nation's largest village. And, you know, when we go to that reading, that talk that Cadwallader Colden, like that, his understanding and summary of it that's captured in that chapter by Johansson, I'm hoping you'll see, is it Johansson? I think it is. Anyway, you know what chapter I'm talking about when we talk about the Confederacy, and this idea that all the different parts of the Confederacy had different places. One was at the eastern door, one was at the western door, one, you know, there was different southwest. They all had a place to play, and that the Mohawk, they were the ones on the eastern door. So that's why when you start to see the play out of the story start to come to head, you'll start to make some connections, I hope, as to why the Mohawk become a very major player in how things start to unfold, because that was their role. They had to protect that area. And, excuse me, I just want to make sure before I don't confuse anybody here. Yeah, the reading, of course, that I'm referencing is Early History, Tribal Perceptions of American Indian Native Democracies. Okay, sorry for that confusion there, sorry. And then the chapter ends by looking at hostilities. They were most common in sedentary societies, and of course, the Anishinaabe, Basil Johnston, he quotes this here. He is quoted, pardon me. The Anishinaabe were primarily men of peace, visionaries who depended upon hunting for survival. Since the worth of a man was measured by his generosity and by his skill in the hunting grounds, bloodshed was not the final test of manhood in the Anishinaabe society. Instead, the warpath was followed when it was deemed necessary to avenge an injury, whether real or imaginary, to oneself or to one's brother. It was a matter of pride never to let insult or injury go unpunished, but never was the conflict begun for the purpose of conquest or subjugation. So this is, this is the review that you kind of go through in this chapter here. So it's not a very heavy chapter. It's not a very long read, but it is a required reading for your midterm that's coming up relatively quickly here on the 13th. So please make some study notes for it. And yeah, I hope this helped. Take some time to go through the chapter on your own, though. All right? Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.